Hello everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. As you can see, I'm still in this new setting for filming videos, so I apologize if anything with the lighting is off or the focus of my camera or anything like this. You know, this is an unfamiliar setting to me, so it's definitely a lot of trial and error for sure, but it is September 16th when I'm filming this, so it's definitely time for my mid-September reading wrap-up. I have 25 books to talk about in today's video. I'm gonna try my best to keep these reviews short and sweet so this video isn't too long. As usual, when I do my wrap-ups, if you're ever interested to see more of my in-depth thoughts about any of the books that I talk about, I highly recommend that you check out my Goodreads account. That is going to be linked down below in my link tree. If you are interested, go ahead and follow me or friend me on there, because I try my best to do a pretty good job of giving like fairly detailed reviews on Goodreads for every book that I read. So first I'm just going to talk about these three novellas together because they're all by the same author and are kind of a part of the same series. So this is Desert Target by Cassie Mint. You guys know that Cassie Mint has very quickly become one of my favorite romance novella authors. She reminds me a lot of Jessa Kane for sure. So this one was about Leaf and Hannah, and with these novellas there's an element of romantic suspense, and all of the novellas in this series take place in some kind of wilderness setting. So this one, as you can tell, it takes place in the desert. The plot of this one, just to keep things as short and sweet as possible, we have Leaf. He's a hired assassin hitman. He is hired to take out this woman known as the Viper. I think she is a member of some kind of like mafia group. She has done some really horrible things, and so he gets this file on this woman, follows her to, I want to say Egypt, somewhere around there, where she seems to be a part of some like vacation group or like tourist group. And so he quickly realizes that the woman he's stalking is not actually the woman who is the Viper, so it's like a mistaken identity thing. And I gave this one 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. This one was actually a really funny like meet cute between the hero and heroine. We have Hannah, our heroine. She's actually a hairdresser, so she's in this like tourist group, and Leaf sneaks up on her to try to murder her. But she thinks it's like this like fun role-playing thing that's a part of the vacation that she booked. And Leaf is just like so confused and like immediately thrown off his game. So loved that. A really fun time for sure. Then the next one that I read in this series was Ocean Jewel. I actually gave this one 5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. We have Roxy and Damien. So it's kind of a forced proximity thing because basically Roxy's brother is like a filmmaker and Damien works for Roxy's brother. And so it's also kind of a forbidden thing because Damien doesn't want to offend Roxy's brother, and Roxy also doesn't want to offend her brother by getting together with Damien. But what really made me give this 5 stars is that, sorry, I'm like referring to my Goodreads because once I finish a book, I can't remember anything about it. But what's really cool is that Roxy is an artist, and so she starts like obsessively drawing Damien, and something about the way how that scene was written like just really drew me in, and like I almost felt like I was Roxy. And yeah, it was just really cool. This was a really cool romance, so had to give it 5 stars. Then the final novella in this series is Arctic Star. This one I gave 4 stars as well. What's interesting about this one is that it features a mute heroine. The basic premise of this one is that our heroine becomes stranded in this Arctic wilderness area, and there is this reclusive man who lives in a cabin in these woods, and so she like beats down his door because she's afraid that something's after her. So I enjoyed this one as well, gave it 4 stars. Yeah, just like a really good time. These are also really great novellas to go with if you're looking for something that's like under 60 pages. I don't think any of her novellas are more than like 50 to 55 pages. So next up we have Teacher's Pet Wolf by Katie Wilde. This is my first novel that I have read by her, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 3.5 stars. It wasn't anything amazing, but I did have a fun time with it. The basic premise, it's about Ranger and Alicia. What I really liked about this premise is that both main characters are werewolves. It wasn't just the hero that was a werewolf, but they're kind of 2 different kinds of werewolves because Ranger was born as a werewolf, whereas Alicia unfortunately was bitten by another werewolf and was cursed to become one. And so she's dealing with a lot of really bad side effects because of this curse. And so these two main characters meet essentially because Alicia is a school teacher and Ranger has been teaching lectures over Zoom to her classes about like wildlife and different things like that. They've both developed crushes for each other over the past year, and so Ranger actually moves to the town where Alicia lives and things go on from there. Like I said, this was a fun time. I think the first half was more fun and entertaining than the second half, which is why I didn't give it 4 stars, but I'm definitely willing to read more from Katie Wilde. So next up, I finally read one of the most emotional and gut-wrenching romances like of all time, and that is All Your Perfects by Colleen Hoover. This was a book that I listed in the 21 books that I want to read in 2021 video. I'll link that video up in the cards above in case you were interested. So the basic premise, it's about Quinn and Graham. There's time jumping between then when they first get together and now when they've been married for about 7 years. Content warning for fertility issues, miscarriage, cheating as well. I mean, this book gets pretty heavy at times, and it truly is a gut-wrenching story, but I just couldn't help but give this 5 stars because, like, I'm trash for the marriage and trouble trope, but I thought that this book did it in a very unique and open and honest way. Things get pretty ugly between these two people throughout the book, you know, and to be honest, at one point, like, I didn't know if these two were gonna make it. I don't know. I thought that Colleen Hoover could write it either way. Either they split up or they stay together. So just know, like, this is a rough ride for sure, but I thought it was spectacular and I couldn't help but give it 5 stars. Next up, I read Queen Takes Rose by Katie Robert. This is the 6th and final book in her Wicked Villain series. I was really looking forward to finishing out this series, and I enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 stars. Now, this one follows Malone and Aurora. In case you don't know, this is a series that is essentially like reimaginings of Disney movies that we all know and love. And so Malone is like a Maleficent type character, but this takes place in a world where there's no magic or anything like that. I thought that would be good to mention. And then Aurora is like Aurora from Sleeping Beauty, right? So yeah, I liked this one. I was a bit skeptical going into it because I wasn't convinced about these two being together, seeing them in previous books in the series, but I thought that Katie Robert did a really good job with their story in this book. Also wanted to quickly mention that these are darker romances with a lot of BDSM going on, and this was my least favorite book of the series, but it was still good. It was still really solid. Next up, we have My Last Duchess by Eloisa James. I was really excited going into this because I'd never read anything by Eloisa James. I actually gave this 3.5 stars though, maybe even leaning more towards 3 stars. This was unfortunately just okay for me, but this is the prequel. I guess it's a novella actually. I don't think it's a full novel because the audiobook was maybe 5 hours. But this is about Hugo and Ophelia, who are the parents of the children in the Wilds of Lindo Castle series, which is very reminiscent of the Bridgerton series, you know, because it's all centered around this one family and it's also a historical romance series. So it was really cool to see this sort of origin story for the family. So we're centered around Hugo. He has quite a few kids. I think he's lost 2 wives at this point, so he's feeling pretty jaded and bitter. And then Ophelia, who was also married in the past, so she is now a widow. I really liked following 2 characters that had each lost a spouse. I think that that brings a really interesting dynamic to a historical romance. And I really had a fun time with like the first 30% or so of this because you could just really feel the chemistry between these 2 characters. And it was just like more entertaining, and the second half, not as much. So yeah, I just gave this 3 stars. Next up, we have This God of Mine by Sophie Jordan. This is what, book 4? Yes, book 4 in her Rogue Files series. And this one is about Lady Clara. So she is desperate to escape life in London. She has essentially ruined herself by pretending to be pregnant to get out of an engagement with a really terrible man. And so she runs off to Scotland, where her brother, the Duke of Autenbury, lives with his wife, to stay with them. And she meets this man, Hunt, who is their next door neighbor. So this gets very convoluted, but essentially Hunt's family is under this like insane curse where all of the men in their family has died after having their first child. And so Hunt thinks he can get around this curse by marrying Clara because he believes her to already be pregnant with somebody else's baby. But of course, like, Claire is not really pregnant, and so of course there's going to be a lot of angst with that. I did think the curse plotline was kind of dumb, but it is Sophie Jordan, so I had a fun time with it still. Like, I gave it 4 stars. I liked the characters. Yeah, this definitely isn't my favorite Sophie Jordan. If I were you just trying to get into Sophie Jordan, I would recommend either While the Duke Was Sleeping or The Duke's Stolen Bride or The Virgin and the Rogue, which are 3 books that are also a part of this same series. Next up, I read By Your Side by Casey West. This is a YA novel that has been on my TBR for a really long time, and I saw that the audiobook was only like 6.5 hours, so I just decided to jump into it one day. And this one is about Dax and Autumn. They essentially get trapped together in this library for an entire weekend, and they kind of know each other from school. Of course, this is YA, so they're both in high school. But Dax is kind of like this misunderstood bad boy, which is like crack to me. I can always read YA romances about bad boys. And then Autumn actually suffers from a lot of anxiety, but nobody really knows except for her family. Like, she doesn't tell her friends or anything because she's worried about what they think of her. So I expected like the entirety of this book to take place while they're trapped in the library, but I'm really happy to say that's not the case. I think around like the 40% mark is when they get out of the library and kind of move on with their lives, and this was just a really adorable romance. There's definitely some heavier scenes and aspects to this book. I thought it had really great anxiety representation, so if you suffer from anxiety as well, I would highly recommend this book. Yeah, I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was solid. I don't know if I'll necessarily read anything else by Casey West because like this didn't completely blow me away, but I thought that it was good. Okay, so this novella was really fun. This is The Secret Note by Lauren Rowe. So Lauren Rowe is an author that I've been meaning to read more from. And I think this is her only novella. It's just about like 60 pages. And we are centering around our 2 main characters, Ben and Kaylee. And so this is a second chance romance. But at the very beginning of this novella, Kaylee sneaks a note to Ben, basically asking him to come into her tent so that they can have some fun times together. And they do, and then 7 years pass, and now Ben is back in Kaylee's life because he has now moved. I believe she lives in Los Angeles, and so he's moved to the area, and so they then start dating each other and having an actual relationship, and this was just so much fun. I gave it 4 stars. I think it's just a really great novella. Also, this was pretty steamy, so highly recommend that if you're looking for some steamy romance novellas. So I'm just gonna very quickly talk about this book because I did DNF it, which means I didn't finish it, but that is Hot Ticket by Olivia Cunning. What drew me in about this book is that it is a rock star romance between a bass player and a fairly famous band, and then a dominatrix, and I thought that that was a very interesting dynamic. And our hero, he likes to be whipped by dominatrixes because he likes that form of pain to help him escape other pains in his life, if that makes sense. And it started off really strong for me, but I felt like this book was pretty long-winded. And yeah, like the part where I DNF'd it, I just found that I didn't really care about their story anymore. So, because they kind of got into a relationship fairly quickly. And I mean, there were other things going on in the story, but I just like didn't care. So yeah, I unfortunately DNF'd this. Next up, we have For Your Own Good by Samantha Downing. I was really excited going into this book because I've been craving thrillers lately. Now that we're getting closer and closer to spooky season, I'm finding that I want to read more thrillers and horror-ish novels, although this definitely isn't a horror novel. But yeah, that's why I picked this up. This is a pretty recent release too. I've also been meaning to check out Samantha Downing because she's a fairly popular thriller novel at this point. I think this is her 3rd book, if I'm not mistaken. But the whole premise of this was that it centers around this guy, Teddy, who's a teacher at this private elite school. And essentially he's doing some shady things for the good of his students. So yeah, that's really all you need to know about the premise. I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I will say, yes, I said this reads more like literary fiction with murders thrown in for a bit of shock value. I would not call this a thriller. I personally didn't see anything thrilling about it, except like I just said, there's some murders throughout. And then what I thought was interesting was that it's not just from Teddy's POV. We get the POVs of all of the people in this story, from other teachers to some students that go to this school. And I thought that that was really interesting. I think what stopped me from giving this 5 stars though is that I did just want like more from the story, and I wanted more from Teddy's character, the teacher. Like, I expected him to be more of like this straight up evil genius, and that's totally not what he is. He's more of a normal guy who does kind of bad things, but yeah, I don't know. I just kind of wanted more, so that's why I gave this 4 stars though. I would recommend checking this out for yourself, especially if you're in the mood for a kind of like dark academia type mystery thriller. Next up, we have Perfect Matcha by Erin McClellan. I was really looking forward to reading this after reading a couple of novellas by this same author. This one's actually an MM romance, which I have not read from this author yet. And this is technically book 3 in a romance series, but each of the books in this series are written by a different author. So I just wanted to read this one because I am a fan of Erin McClellan, and this definitely did not disappoint. I did give this 4 stars. I thought it was just really solid, really sweet, but also sexy MM romance. And I liked that the 2 main characters of the story were childhood friends. I love that trope of like childhood friends to lovers. And I thought that there was like the perfect amount of angst. And as usual with Erin McClellan, if you are a fan of the use of toys during steamy scenes, you will love this. So yeah, it was just a really fun time. All right, next up we have Coltie by Mariana Zapata. Yes, I finally read another Mariana Zapata book. This is the 3rd book that I am reading by her, or that I have read by her. And I loved it just as much as everybody else does. I mean, yeah. Mariana Zapata, I still to this day say that nobody writes romance like Mariana Zapata. And it's not just the fact that she writes these extreme slow burns, because she does. I mean, this book was well over 500 pages. She's the queen of slow burns. But just the way that she writes, the development of her relationships in her books, like, it's just, there's nothing quite like it that I have ever read. And so this is a soccer romance, as you can kind of tell, right? I feel like I'm one of the last people in the romance community to read this. Yeah, definitely late to the game with reading Mariana Zapata in general. But this one is about Sal. She is a soccer player for this team in Houston, and this guy, Reiner Coltie, who is quite a bit older than her. I want to say he's like 10-ish years older than her. He signs on as an assistant coach for the team that she plays for, but when Sal was a kid, he was a very famous soccer player himself. So this is like the grumpiest of grumpy heroes for sure. It's really cool to see these 2 people form a friendship, because at the beginning that just seems absolutely impossible. And not only did they form a friendship, but typical with Mariana Zapata, in the last 50 pages or so, they actually get together as a, you know, in a romantic relationship, in a romantic way. And yeah, like just the way that she writes it, like I never get annoyed with how slow burn it is. And I always find when I get to the end that I could read at least 50 more pages about this couple. Like, man, her books are just so addictive. So yeah, highly recommend this one if you are someone like me who has put off reading this for way too long. All right, guys, next up we have When You Wish Upon a Duke by Cheris Michaels. I was so excited going into this book. I got an arc of this off of NetGalley because I read the first installment last year and really enjoyed it. And so this is an interesting historical romance series because these are essentially reimaginings of fairy tales that we all know and love. And so this one's kind of a take on Peter Pan, where we have our main character Isabel Tinker. So she's kind of a Tinkerbell-like character. She works for this travel agency. And then our hero, he is a duke. He comes in to ask her to be a guide for him while he travels to Iceland to rescue some friends of his that have been kidnapped by pirates. And so that's the basic premise. I was loving, I would say, the first like 60 to 70% of this. I loved the buildup of their relationship, and I thought it just had such a unique feel to it because a lot of this book takes place in Iceland. I've never read a historical romance that takes place there, but unfortunately the last 30% of this book really dragged, and I just could not wait to finish it. and not in a good way. So I unfortunately gave this 3 stars because that last 30% of the book just really dragged down my experience, my reading experience. Next up we have Look the Part by Jewel E. Ann. I was really looking forward to this book because it came highly recommended from Bree from In 11 Words. I will link her channel somewhere, either up in the cards or down in the description below. I always trust her recommendations. I think her and I have similar reading tastes, so I was really looking forward to this one. This is definitely a grumpy sunshine romance between Flint, who is a lawyer, and some years earlier he was driving drunk and his wife and child were in the car, and unfortunately it caused his wife to pass away, and so now he is very bitter from that experience, and he, you know, definitely blames himself for her death. And so their child is now, like, I want to say like 12 or something like that, and he is on the autism spectrum. Then we have our heroine Ellen, and she's actually a music therapist, which I thought was really, really cool because I'm a musician myself and I've never read about a music therapist in a romance before. She ends up renting an office on the floor above Flint's office. Flint owns the building, I believe. And so then Flint's son ends up going to play music with Ellen and starts to become friends with her. So that was really cool to see those two characters form a really fun relationship and friendship. So I definitely think Harrison, Flint's son, was definitely my favorite character of this book, but I did really enjoy Ellen and Flint as well. I thought it was just a really great Grumpy Sunshine romance. And I do want to say that this romance gets pretty heavy at times. This book actually gave me some vibes of The Gravity of Us by Brittany C. Cherry. So if you're a fan of that book, I would highly recommend checking this one out, but definitely check out the content warnings because, like I said, this is definitely a very emotional book at times. So next I read 2 novellas by Jessa Kane that are actually connected to one another, which is really interesting because I don't think that Jessa Kane has ever written more than one novella about any particular couple. So the first one is Making Their Vows, and so what immediately drew me into the plot of this one is that it's another one of her new adult romances. So both of the characters are 18, they're like in their senior year of high school, but it's kind of like a standard star-crossed lovers story for sure. We have Grace, who comes from a very wealthy family. She goes to this elite private school, and then we have North, who is definitely from like the wrong side of the tracks in Boston, and he's like an underground fighter. And so they meet because one of Grace's like asshole friends wants to try to beat someone up in an underground fight. And so from the moment their eyes meet, they are like immediately in love with each other. Like seriously, if you are a fan of insta love, you will love Jessa Kane for sure. And so yeah, it's definitely a forbidden romance for sure, but I gave this 5 stars. I love, love, love her new adult romances. And so then there's actually a sequel that she wrote to their romance, which is called Renewing Their Vows. Now, this novella, I kind of hate talking about it because I think you can only get this if you're subscribed to Jessa Kane's newsletter. And I'm not sure if it's available in like every newsletter that she sends out or if it was just available through the newsletter that announced Making Their Vows. So like I feel kind of bad because I feel like most of you aren't going to be able to get your hands on this novella, but what I will say is that it's not the most necessary thing to read. I mean, I still had a fun time with it. I gave it 4 stars. I don't think it was quite as good as Making Their Vows, but it was still really solid. I actually really liked following this couple more because I just really loved them in the first novella. All right, so next up, let's move on to The Heart Principle by Helen Huang. Oh my goodness, do I have conflicting feelings about this book. So this book in particular, I wrote a pretty lengthy Goodreads review about, so definitely check that out if you want to know more of my thoughts about this. So I gave it 4 stars. This is the 3rd book in this companion romance series, and we were finally getting Kwan's story, who was a featured character in the 2 previous books in the series. And then our heroine is Anna, who is a violinist, and essentially throughout this story she gets a diagnosis for autism spectrum disorder, and so she's coming to terms with that. And then Kwan actually, so there's like a 2-year gap between The Bride Test, which was the previous book in this series, and The Heart Principle, and in those 2 years Quan actually went through testicular cancer. So he's now in remission, but he's still dealing with a lot psychologically. So yeah, this is definitely not a lighthearted book. It's definitely a pretty heavy book. Definitely go into this knowing that, because I feel like the cover, you wouldn't know that based on this cover. And the two previous books in this series were definitely more lighthearted. Something else to know about this book is that it is semi-biographical for Helen Huang and her journey into discovering her autism spectrum disorder and things like that. There's also other things going on in Helen's life that are put into this book. So just know this is like 70% a sad and heavy book. Very heavy for sure. You know, that's one of the things I feel conflicted about, is that as much as I appreciated Anna and Quan's journey, this was just a heavy book a lot of the time. And I feel like the romance definitely took a back seat to everything else going on in both Anna and Quan's life. So I think I'm gonna leave my thoughts there. I still definitely really enjoyed it and appreciated it for what it was. It's just very different from the first two books. And like I said, I have more thoughts in my Goodreads review if you're interested. Next up, I read A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. Like I said earlier, I'm in kind of a thriller mood right now. So this is actually a YA thriller. It's also book one in a trilogy. So I'm definitely looking forward to reading the second and third books as soon as possible. But this is about our main character. I can't remember her name. I'm just terrible at remembering character names, just know that. But for her like senior project, she wants to study this murder cold case that happened in her town some years before. I want to say like 6 or 7 years ago. So that's what this book is about. She's essentially investigating this murder as a civilian. And this gave me vibes of Sadie by Courtney Summers, if you know that book and you're a fan of that book. Also because the audiobook has a full cast of characters and narrators, and I thought that was really cool. I gave this 5 stars. I thought this was a spectacular YA thriller. And that's coming from someone who doesn't really enjoy YA thrillers all that much. Like, I've only found a few that I've really loved. We'll say I kind of guessed the plot twist, but I kind of didn't. Like, I was like half right. But yeah, I recommend this, and I'm definitely planning on reading the rest of the series. All right, guys, we have a few books left, I promise. I'm just gonna briefly talk about The Wrong Marquis by Vivian Lorette. This was also an arc that I got off of NetGalley. I'm just gonna be upfront. I gave this like 3.5-ish stars. This one is about our heroine, Ellie, and she's been in love with this guy since they were children. He is now a Marquis, but now there is this other man, Brendan, who is also a Marquis, who she starts to quickly fall in love with, and now she's definitely conflicted as to who she should be with for a lot of the book, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I didn't give this a very high rating. It started to annoy me how much it felt like she was like flip-flopping between these two men when like Brandon was like clearly the better choice. Yeah, and I just felt like I wasn't as engaged in the second half as I was in the first half. So yeah, this was just okay for me. All right, then next was The Arrangement, another thriller. So this one is a Lifetime movie in book form, straight up. We have our main character. Is her name Nat? Again, guys, you guys know, I can't remember character names. I'm pretty sure her name was Nat, but she moves to New York City to go to art school, but she quickly comes into financial troubles, and so one of her friends from college tells her about being a sugar baby, and so she becomes one herself, and she quickly forms this relationship with one man in particular whose name is Gabe. But their relationship doesn't end well. He ends up breaking up with her, but she is like obsessed with him. And yeah, things go on from there. I gave this 4 stars. I knew what I was getting myself into when I read this. You know, it's definitely not the highest quality of thrillers out there, but I love these kind of plots. Like I said, like a Lifetime movie in book form. I am trash for Lifetime movies. So I knew this was gonna be a fun time, and it totally was. And I totally guessed the plot twist from a mile away. and I don't even care because I just had a fun time. All right guys, last but certainly not least, I read the last 3 novellas in the Mindf series by St. Abbey. I've talked about this series a little bit in the past, but this is about Lana, who is a serial killer. She specifically is killing off these men that did something really, really, really terrible to her and her brother 10 years ago. And then this is a romance with this man, Logan, who is an FBI agent who specifically investigates serial killers, right? So of course they're doomed from the start. The 3rd book, Scarlet Angel, I thought really stepped things up in a big way. Like, there were some really great epic moments going on, and there's also a cliffhanger at the end of all of these novellas except for the final one, and so I just couldn't resist reading the other 2 novellas, and I loved them just as much. Like, I feel like these last 3 novellas just stepped things up for sure. The 4th novella is All the Lies. I thought this was even more epic and messed up than the last installment. I think this 4th book is also arguably the hardest to read because we finally get the full story of what actually happened to Lana and her brother. So definitely content warnings for just brutal torture and rape. And of course for this whole series, brutal murders. I mean, St. Abbey is definitely not afraid to go there with descriptions of things. So definitely wanted to throw that out there. And then the last novella is Painted All Red. This is also the longest novella of the series. I think it's just about like 150 pages. I thought that this ended the series in a spectacular way. There's like Saw-esque moments in this going on. Like, it's just really cool. And I thought that it just wrapped things up in a really awesome way. Even though it's a very dark series, it is a romance series. You know, there's a really, really strong romance between Logan and Lana, and there is a happily ever after. So know that going into it. I think it's good to know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel when reading really dark books like this. So highly, highly recommend this series. I think it's fantastic. Thank you so much, Jess from Peace Love Books, for putting this series on my radar because I had never heard of it before. And do not let these terrible covers deter you. This really is a spectacular series. All right, guys, I did it. We talked about 25 books that I've read so far in the month of September. I would love it if you would leave a comment down below if you want to tell me about some of the books that you've been reading this month. And yeah, I would also love it if you would leave a like and subscribe. And I thank you so much in advance if you do. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.